Okay. All right. So we're just going to start. Greetings and welcome to Ill Repute, a history of notorious women, where we look at the lives of women who lived audaciously and flew in the face of convention, whether they were scientists making new discoveries in a hostile world or criminals foiling the law at every turn. I'm your host, Sovereign Sire, a former sex worker, a writer, screenwriter, and stand-up comedian. And I am joined by...
Hello, darling. I am an adult film performer, a tech entrepreneur, an ex-librarian, and I don't know, your girl of the day?
My Girl Friday.
I'm your girl Friday.
There are some listeners that are going to be very familiar with Ill Repute. This is a relaunch. This is one of our relaunch episodes. Formerly, the show was co-hosted by Susie Q. James, who has very graciously passed on the crown to Miss Ella Darling. And we are continuing onward and upward. And we will be coming out with episodes every 2 weeks with topics ranging from historical profiles to topical discussions to interviews. And all of it centers around outrageous women. And I'm very excited to be here with you.
I am really excited to be here with you too. And yeah, and just a little extra love to Susie. I'm really honored to be able to step in and join you here. And hi, all of you Ill Repute listeners. I hope I don't let you down. And yeah, I'm really psyched to be here with you.
Yeah, I've been so excited to bring this show back. The pandemic hit, people's lives got hectic, things moved around, things changed, priorities shifted, different things were urgent. And I will eventually get into where I've been for the last year and a half. I'm sure in future episodes I will delve into what mysteries I discovered while I was on sabbatical, as I'll call it. But I've been really excited to bring the podcast back and to help it grow and just keep evolving into the vision that I had when I first started it. But today we're going to start with a profile, and we're going to be profiling the one and the only Jay-Z Knight. And we will decide at the end what category of ill repute she falls into because she is a very controversial figure. And you probably have not heard of her if you are under the age of like 35. Her big heyday was in the 80s, but if you had woo-woo hippie parents, you may very well be familiar with her. So it really kind of depends on what kind of parents you had. Will dictate whether or not you're familiar with Jay-Z Knight. And even if you're not familiar with Jay-Z Knight, as we get into this profile, you will definitely recognize people of her oeuvre, as it were. One of them is even running for president, possibly. So if you don't know Jay-Z Knight, you definitely know people like her that have become quite famous.
I am not familiar with Jay-Z Knight, as you know, and I have adamantly refused to educate myself about Jay-Z Knight so that I could allow you to have the honor. But I just love that you've already implied that I'm like under 35-ish. Like, I love you too, babe.
Honestly, my mom was a big fan of the Course in Miracles and has a lot of woo-woo beliefs. And I asked her about Jay-Z Knight, and she was like, I kind of remember, but not really. So I guess it just depends on where your areas of interest. To me, she's super famous.
She seems like everything you're saying. I'm shocked that I personally am not familiar with her, because she seems like someone I would at least be aware of in my youth. So I'm excited.
I mean, I'm definitely a connoisseur of batshit crazy.
Yeah,
so
I love that shit.
I'm a batshit crazy connoisseur. So to me, she is like an all-star. She's really up there in terms of just hustler, grifter, all the things I love in a woman, just take no prisoners, no quarter, relentless, ruthless, girl boss all the way into the fucking sun. That's my kind of woman.
That's bitchin'. I love this. Okay, how many times married off the bat, real quick?
Okay. How many times has she been married?
Yes.
Numbers are out, but they believe she's at 5.
At 5.
Yeah, which she's almost beat out my father. So a year after she was born, Roswell became a town famous throughout the world when an unidentified flying object was believed to have crashed near there. The incident gained significant attention and became one of the most famous and controversial UFO cases in history. This will be important later.
Roswell, New Mexico, side note, is where if you were a young woman in Carlsbad, New Mexico, for some reason, attending middle school where your mascot was actually the demons, I shit you not, and my elementary school mascot was the bats, you would go to Roswell, New Mexico to buy your school clothes. So this, I think, tells a huge story about who I am today, that I lived in Carlsbad, New Mexico, and my mascots were the bats and the demons, and I went to Alien Town to buy my, knockoff Jinkos.
Is Alien Town what they call Roswell, or is that the name of a store in Roswell?
I just made it up. I made it up to call that Roswell, but that didn't make sense. But no, I loved it there. They had a little museum that I would go to, and they were so nice to me because I was a little kid and I was so excited and enthusiastic. And they would just remember me every time I would come for school clothes shopping. We'd go to the museum and they'd see me every year, and they were just so sweet. Anyway, in early July of 1947, a local rancher named Mac Brazel discovered debris scattered across his property about 75 miles north of Roswell. The debris consisted of metallic-like materials, rubber strips, and thin, lightweight metallic foil. On July 8, 1947, a press release by the Roswell Army Airfield, the RAAF, stated that they had recovered a flying disc. This announcement attracted widespread media attention, leading to headlines declaring the capture of a flying saucer. The following day, the RAAF revised its statement, claiming that the recovered debris was not a flying disc, but rather the remnants of a weather balloon and associated equipment. The revised explanation suggested that the initial press release had been a misidentification. The official explanation did not satisfy some people, and conspiracy theories surrounding the Roswell incident emerged over the years. Many believed that the debris was, in fact, from an extraterrestrial spacecraft and that the government had engaged in a cover-up.
So the incident faded from public attention until the late 1970s, when interest in UFOs surged. Investigative authors and researchers began interviewing witnesses, including military personnel and locals, who claimed to have knowledge or involvement in the events surrounding the crash. Multiple theories exist regarding the Roswell incident. Some propose that the debris was indeed from an extraterrestrial spacecraft, while others suggest it was part of a classified military project. Skeptics argue that the whole incident was a result of misidentification and confusion. The Roswell incident became a significant part of UFO lore and influenced popular culture. It inspired books, documentaries, movies, and TV shows, further fueling public fascination with UFOs and extraterrestrial life. Now, I've gone into detail here because the Roswell incident undeniably had an impact on the town and on a young Judith, which will become apparent as we continue. Living in a town where there was a supposed alien spacecraft crash, sight undoubtedly created an environment where Judith was exposed to ideas of mystery and government cover-ups. And the later resurgence of interest in the 1970s coincides with Judith's first appearance on the public radar with an equally intriguing story. I'm going to discuss Judith's childhood as taken from her own memoir, A State of Mind. A content warning for listeners: there will be discussions of sexual assault with a child victim, domestic violence, and substance abuse. As I go through this story, I'm going to be noting points where I want you to just put a pin in it, because as we move through her life, much like, one of those case file boards in police stations when they're working on a crime, if you start connecting the dots, a narrative starts to form around Judith's story and how there's certain themes and what she's going through at different time periods seems to get transformed and turned around in her narrative. It gets pulled into it. It gets folded into her story and changed slightly. But when you step back and you look at everything that was going around her contextually, you see that she was actually just borrowing a lot of things from what was going on around her. So Judith was born into poverty. Her mother, Helen Prentice Hart, had left home at 13 and found work as a cook. She quickly married an older man and had 2 children. The marriage didn't work out, and in the divorce, her mother-in-law pressured her to give up the 2 children so they could have a better life. Her husband was from a family that was far better off. After leaving her husband and children, she found work picking cotton in East Texas. Working in the cotton fields, she met Judith's father, Charles Hampton. So she quickly became pregnant again, but didn't stop working, giving birth to the child in the cotton fields. She had another child 2 years later. The marriage wasn't a happy one. Charles would spend his money as soon as he got it on booze and women and was often gone from the house, but her mother persevered. So she was born in New Mexico and grew up in East Texas. Both of her parents picked cotton, and all of the children picked cotton, which may sound a little crazy, but back in 1946, it wasn't uncommon for people that lived in poverty or people that worked for farmers or people that did sharecropping, any of this, that people would go to work as soon as they were physically able to.
Yeah.
They wouldn't be doing as rigorous work as the adults, but they would be learning how to work. So they would be keeping their mom company alongside, be alongside their parents while their parents were picking cotton, and they would be learning how to do it and how to withstand the weather and all of those kinds of things. And that's something that I'm from Fresno, California, and I'm friends with a lot of people whose parents were migrant farm workers and would tell very similar experiences of being very, very young and being out in the fields just alongside their parents because there weren't babysitters.
Right, of course.
So it was a very rural, unglamorous existence. And her father also worked in the fields, but apparently her father would take all of his paychecks and then immediately go and spend them in the bars, getting really drunk, and would be gone for days at a time. And then when he would run out of money, he would get sort of dumped off in a car. Like a car would pull up to the shack they lived in and would sort of like dump him off. And then he would sort of sober up, go back to work, and do the same thing again. After the birth of their second child, the family moved, hitchhiking over 1,000 miles to Dexter, New Mexico, where they were hired on to do irrigation and planting for a local farmer. While living there, her father came home drunk one day and got into a fight with her mother. He beat her mother, and when one of her other children, Bootsy, tried to intervene, her mother told Bootsy to run. Bootsy took some marbles and went out to play. When she dropped her bag of marbles into an irrigation ditch, she drowned trying to retrieve them. Helen was already 4 months pregnant with her next child at this point. So she's already had 4 children, is pregnant with her 5th.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
That's tragic.
Yeah. So 12 years after Bootsy's death, Judith was born. Judith was Helen's 8th child. She had 1 more. So in the end, she had 9 children, but she had given birth to 10 children, starting at the age of 13. So,
Wow.
I mean, I was recently doing the ancestry for my family, and nearly everyone in my family comes from Tennessee and were farmers, and they all had 5 to 10 children and got married between the ages of like 15 and 18.
Right.
And their spouses were the same age. They were both kids.
Yeah.
But there was nothing else to do. You just got to work. Yeah.
Yeah. At what age did she have her last child? And around what age did you find, like when you observed people like your family? Like when do they typically stop having kids?
They stop having kids when they stop being able. So a lot of times they would have their first kid at 16, 17, 18, and they would be having their last child like in their early 40s. like, here's the thing is Judith's story kind of shifts a lot depending on who she's talking to.
Okay.
So I read through dozens of interviews. I read her book. I watched several documentaries. I watched a lot of interviews, like video interviews. And the basic through line of her story stays the same, but it does seem to shift just depending on where in time we are and who she's talking to in the context of the conversation. It may seem like it's kind of jumping all over the place, but there's a method to my madness. Having said all of that about her story shifting around, I did do her family tree because census records dropped. So anyone born before 1950, I can find you. So I did her family tree, and this does check out where they're living, what their stated occupations are, all of it. In as much as that they grew up poor, they lived in these small areas, the family was that big, all of those things do bear out. So that, like, her story is true in terms of this early part of her life. It seems it's pretty consistently verifiable through records, and the need to verify her story is going to become clear as we keep going. So throughout her memoir, I would constantly be like jumping between fact-checking sources. She learned to be very labile with the truth. Judith tells us that at the age of 4, a terrible event happened that shaped a great deal of her life. So there's a trigger warning for anyone that does not feel like hearing about sexual assault with a child victim. This is your warning. You can just skip ahead about 2 minutes and we will be out of this territory. Okay. When she was 4 years old, she was still having trouble not wetting her pants. So one day she'd had an accident and she snuck back into the house to clean herself up and put on new panties without her parents knowing. While she was doing this, her uncle, who was asleep in the house and drunk, woke up. I'm not going to go into detail here, but Judith describes a harrowing and violent rape against her. She ran outside to tell her mother, who listened to her describe the story. Her mother went into the house, but her uncle had disappeared. Thinking Judith was making it up, her mother told her she had just had an accident and not to worry about it. Because she had trouble with continence, she frequently had rashes and infections, so it was hard for her mom to see that something was wrong. She didn't look any worse for wear than she kind of already did because she was having these continence issues. I checked the census at that time, and her father's brother was living at the house. So I believe that this really happened 100%. And it makes a lot of sense because the way she talks about it later and how she lived her life, it has a lot of adaptations that happen to people when they've been abused as a child.
Yeah. There are some
So
marks.
yeah, there's a lot about the kind of woman she became that makes a lot of sense when you contextualize it within the context of this kind of an upbringing. Because essentially what she's describing in this first part of the book is her introduction to the world is that it's a very brutal place, that life is very hard. Everyone has to work. No one ever gets any breaks. And you move around a lot. So everything is temporary. So it's not necessarily a good place to grow a stable personality.
Right.
So it's difficult to hear any story of sexual assault, but assaults that involve violence in very young children is especially difficult. And that she remembers everything about the event with crystal clarity, even in her 40s, when the memoir was written, is a powerful testimony to the impact that sexual violence has on people's lives. They contend with the trauma for the rest of their lives. When she describes this event in the book, I mean, she recalls smells, exactly what was said. And I remember as I was reading it, thinking how crazy that is, given that she's describing an event that happened 40 years previous to when she's writing, and she can still recall like everything about it. Mm-hmm. Her quote in the book, she said, "The event left a deep and ugly scar that would later cause me to mistrust all men. I owned a terrible secret, one that destroyed my innocence, my open love and trust for others, and for many years to come, ruined my self-respect."
Wow.
I think it can't be understated what a revolution it was in the 70s and 80s when childhood sexual abuse and domestic violence were starting to be talked about. Judith comes from a generation of women that were the first to be able to speak openly about sexual abuse and domestic violence. Her memoir was published in 1988 when this discussion was somewhat normalized, but her inclusion of it in her memoir is still courageous. I've talked about this a lot with my mother and how taboo this subject was up until this time, and being disbelieved and hushed up was very common, which is something that younger listeners may find hard to believe, but it truly was a different time. And sexualized violence against women and young girls was rampant, and there were very few resources for victims to report crimes to, and people didn't know how to treat or care for victims of these crimes. The language in the literature just simply wasn't there. I bring this up because untreated trauma causes the brain to do a lot of heavy lifting to help a victim survive. And yeah, her brain started doing a lot of interesting things.
Yeah, absolutely. The trauma that we carry like manifests in a lot of ways in our bodies and in everything. But especially
Uh,
at that time, just that time, you can you speak to sort of like can you speak to that a little bit more? Because like what was different about that time compared to
so,
what
okay,
we see now?
domestic violence wasn't something that was really talked about or recognized, really, I think, until the 70s as a result of feminism. And as women started to have discussions around marriage and divorce and being able to have their own credit cards, this conversation started to emerge around domestic abuse. Obviously, people knew that these things happened, but they just weren't discussed and pathologized in the way that they are now. It would be like they fight a lot. There weren't necessarily these terms like domestic violence. These terms weren't necessarily so prevalent. People were just beginning to have a name for this very specialized kind of brutality, right?
Right, we didn't have the language
Um,
framework and the context for it. And I think
yeah.
marital rape wasn't fully outlawed in America until the 90s, I think. You
Probably not. I mean,
correct
I
me
will
but yeah, so just to paint a picture of what was going on then, because
yeah.
yeah.
Her book also does dovetail with the Satanic Panic,
Mm.
and the Satanic Panic can actually be viewed in the context of revelations about domestic violence and child sexual abuse, which is child sexual abuse was definitely not something people talked about. Like, it really was not. And a lot of theories say that the Satanic Panic actually emerged because the prevalence of sexual abuse was rampant, and that was becoming clear. And the majority of perpetrators of that violence were family members. And that revelation was so uncomfortable for people that the Satanic Panic is viewed as a reaction to that increased discussion around child sexual abuse. It was a desire by society in general to make the perpetrator these roving gangs of Satanists go around the country, like abducting children and putting them through these crazy rituals. It was just easier for people to stomach
And the fact that
than,
it was their own, like the kid's own family and the people that were
yeah,
actually the stewards of these children were failing them immensely and violently and aggressively.
yeah. I guess the difference is the 70s was people started talking about it, and the 80s was they started actually listening
Mhm.
and believing the children and believing people when they told these stories. That's what made the 80s different. And you also had, my mom's a boomer. So you have this, it's like this first generation that they had become teenagers and young adults during the civil rights movement in the 60s and the free love, the summer of love in 68, right? So you have, and then, so those people that were completely pushing back against society and tradition and institutions, right? So as they become adults and they start entering into marriage and they start having children, they start talking about things like domestic violence and sexual abuse because they're the first generation that can. And like as they're moving into marriage, like their They're coming from a generation that was out in the streets protesting. They're coming from a generation that was talking about feminism and this and that. So as that generation of people started moving into those traditional milestones of getting married, having children, they're starting to talk about these things.
People really found their voice when they hit the streets to protest.
Yes. So shortly after the traumatizing incident when she's 4, her mother, Helen, finally left her father. By this time, Judith's older siblings were already out of the house, and it was just Judith and her little brother, Loy, left in the home. She was 5. Her mother moved them to Artesia, New Mexico. Being a single divorced mother with children in the 1950s with no education meant the path to success was narrow. The only real way out was through marriage, so this time her mother married for money. She married a man named Bill Angeli who owned a sporting goods store in town. I think the inclusion of this detail is interesting because it shows how girls are indoctrinated into the patriarchy. I think a lot about Oriana Small's memoir about being a porn star, Girlvert, where she talks about her relationship with her mother, and she says, all I knew about being a woman was that you lied. Being a woman was being a liar. And that really resonated with me because I thought of Small's memoir actually many times throughout Jay-Z Knight's memoir, because the way that her mother is featured in the memoir is she's at one moment kind of very supportive of Jay-Z, and at the other very ruthless and kind of mercenary in how she approaches love and relationships. You know, she married the first guy because she was 13 and she was on her own. So she marries an older guy and has 2 kids with him. Then they get divorced and the guy's mom says, we're taking the children. She says, okay. Then she goes out, works in the cotton field. She marries a hot guy that she's in love with. He turns out to be a drunk and a womanizer, and he beats her and all of this kind of, he's irresponsible. He indirectly contributed to the death of one of their children. So then she's like going to marry because of her options. She's talking about how her mom's options were limited. So this time she was going to marry for practical reasons. And it really just struck me that what she took away from that relationship with her mother, the lessons she was taking away from her, were all about being mercenary. And that sort of what you feel doesn't matter, and everything's about practicality. And Judith is someone that gets accused quite frequently of being a very dishonest person. Some would say even a fraud. And I was just reading the first part of the book, and I was picking up very early on in these little subtle ways that she was being taught to lie by her mother, that lying is an integral part of survival as a woman. You lie about how you feel, you lie about who you're in love with, you lie about what you want. That everything that you get through subterfuge and through subversion, right?
Right. Absolutely.
And so I looked at it and went like, oh, I see all the ways that she was primed to become what she has become. So Judith was enrolled in a school in a wealthy district, and it was the first time that she realized she was poor white trash, which was something that made her feel ostracized and invisible. Over the intervening years, her mother learned to sew better clothes, and she was eventually able to fit in with her peers. And when she turned 13, she had become beautiful. One of the things that was frustrating about researching Jay-Z is because she's a living person, because she's a contemporary, there aren't a lot of books about her that she didn't write. I don't think there's anything just dedicated to her. A lot of things get said over and over again without anyone citing where it's coming from. So supposedly she spent time as a rodeo queen, supposedly. She doesn't mention it in the memoir that I read. I don't know if she says that in something that I missed, but she does talk about basically her mom married up and she got to this better school. And in another interview I listened to with her when she was looking back, she mentions this feeling of not feeling important or special to anyone, this feeling of being poor and being obviously poor and like having not had an experience of that before this. But she took to it really quickly and jumped in and figured out how to survive in a world where, oh, this is my value. This is my social capital. And she suddenly put all this energy into her looks. But she talks about that she had a horse and her favorite thing to do was to kind of just go ride by herself. And she said that she was very popular by the time she left high school, but she still preferred to be alone. And that's another example of the coping mechanisms that I see from having grown up from, while she describes the sexual assault as a child as being the traumatic incident, I see, having been someone that grew up in poverty, it's the whole experience wrapped into a ball that really creates the trauma. It's living in poverty, it's the instability, the insecurity, it's witnessing the abuse of a parent, and it's the brutality that she experienced. It's all of it. It's very ambient.
She was very much living in a world that her peers could not possibly fathom.
Yes. I mean, when someone's describing their parent working, picking cotton, and they're in a papoose on her back, I mean, that has to impact you when you're watching someone do that kind of labor. And she's doing that kind of labor because her husband's off drinking. So it's also, when she said she had learned to mistrust men, I was like, was that because of what happened to you, or is it because of what happened to your mom?
Yeah.
Right?
Like, she and her mom were pretty much failed by men, like all of the men in her life so far.
So I related to this memoir. We had a lot of similar experiences, and the realization of your lower class status is a real head fuck when you're a kid. I also had an ugly duckling moment, and there's something very, very powerful about realizing that even though you're poor, if you're beautiful, you can still transcend class differences if you're a woman. I think it's important to point out these places in the narrative where patriarchy is at work. I think we throw words like that around a lot without being able to point to circumstances in everyday life where it's at play. But her mother's marriage for money and her sudden ascension into respectable society when she became beautiful are important to note in her story. This is a woman who grew up in a world that was dangerous for women, traumatized them, and objectified them. Lying by marrying someone for comfort instead of love were normalized and expected. So by the time she was in middle school, she had become a majorette, a baton twirler, a decidedly middle-class hobby. Despite now being beautiful and popular, she still felt disconnected from people. She describes having felt a presence around her and a voice that would talk to her. She describes it like a professor giving fascinating lectures. She never really thought about it as being different or didn't realize that other people didn't have a running commentary going through their minds at all times. She says that the spirit giving lectures would use words she didn't understand, so she would ask her mother, and finally her mother bought her a dictionary. She told her mother at one point about the voice that she heard, and her mother told her not to tell anyone else about it. I thought this was really interesting if it's true. Do you have an inner narrator?
I do sometimes, yes. It's kind of my own voice. But I also have another inner narrator that I kind of tap into and manifest. This is, ever since I started microdosing mushrooms, I have sort of felt like I have this better narrator in my head. Sometimes it's just like a lot like me, but more calm and collected. Kind of like I created Ella Darling, which is like me, but more sexual and socially capable.
Yeah.
But yeah, that but what she's describing very much sounds like some
schizophrenia.
Sort of schizophrenia or some sort of something around that.
But I also know that some people, I'm not going to do it justice, but if I say apple, some people picture like a drawing of an apple. Some people see the word apple, and then some people see an actual apple. It just has to do with like the way that your consciousness kind of comes together. It doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with you. It's just different people have different ways their brain kind of puts all the information together to create thoughts. But she's describing what she says, and what she describes in her memoir is a voice that's not hers talking to her about life, reality, the nature of the universe, all this kind of stuff, and is using language so sophisticated she doesn't know what it means and has to ask her mom to buy her like a reference book, right? That sounds pretty crazy.
Yes.
And her mom telling her not to tell anyone about it. And this is another place where throughout the memoir, her mom is at times really supportive and like on her side, and then suddenly very dismissive, like not believing her about the uncle and then telling her just not to tell anyone about the voice. There doesn't seem to be like any concern.
Right.
And that's what made me feel like her mom's kind of made up.
My takeaway from that was don't tell anyone about it because that's going to draw attention. And if they think that something's wrong with you, you might be taken away. Or, like like any attention is bad attention if you're a kid in a certain circumstance.
Yeah.
But I don't know. But yeah, I hesitate to say schizophrenia. It is like that kind of thing. Hearing like hallucinations of that sort are symptomatic of a couple of different conditions. But it's definitely, I think that goes beyond just the sort of like how someone thinks. That's not just like your internal narrator. My internal narrator doesn't teach me vocabulary words. I wish the bitch did. Kind of falling down on the job.
Well, there are different kind of studies around consciousness that have there's some interesting ideas around how consciousness works. And one of them is that we kind of imagine ourselves as the driver in the car, right? But that driver is actually multiple different consciousnesses at once. So like in order for a car to work, it's not just that I turn the ignition. It's the ignition starts a series of processes that are happening all over the car, and it's electrical system through the mechanics of the engine. All kinds of processes are happening all at once. But as we drive, it's like I push the gas pedal and then it goes, and then I push the brake and it stops.
Mm-hmm.
And that for a lot of people, that's how they experience consciousness. But there are studies, especially with people that have dissociative identity disorder and people that have loss of short-term memory. I think a lot of it's anecdotal at this point, but there's this idea that at different times we have different drivers, but we just experience them as like one person, and that people that have different types of brain injuries will experience something that feels like someone else. It's just they've become more aware of a process.
Yes, I think
that normally is invisible.
Absolutely. And I would not be shocked if there is some sort of disassociation that came about as a result of her trauma.
Yes.
Like,
definitely.
That just seems like no shit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Judith describes her first otherworldly encounter at a slumber party at a friend's house. The girls were all majorettes and were staying over to practice their routines. While they were listening to a Bobby Darin record, a light appeared outside the window. They looked outside and saw a giant orange ball of light hovering over a neighbor's house. It hovered there, then started flashing, then it disappeared. She didn't remember this incident until years later. So she talks about it that this moment happened and then they were all freaked out about it. And then the next day, everyone went about their business like nothing had happened, and that she didn't even remember it until years later. This is where we get into that's a pretty spectacular event to just not remember, and for there not to be news reports about, giant orbs in the sky. And I think one of the things about Judith is I realized in reading her memoir that part of the power of her con is that she wraps a lot of truth up and then sprinkles it with stuff that just kind of beggars belief. So she's kind of got this gritty memoir of this, really intense childhood. And then she starts just dropping these little things that just don't seem, that are ridiculous.
Yeah, enough.
I would hear a voice all the time, and my mom had to buy a dictionary and to that. But because she's just taken you along for this ride where she's talking about these really harrowing experiences that I think for a lot of women are very relatable, right? And then she slips in this stuff that's just a little bit convenient and a little bit. And of course, this happened in Roswell. This is why I said her being born in Roswell is important, right?
Yes.
So by the time she was 17, she was starting to have dreams of having lived in another lifetime. When she told her mother about it, her mother told her that she was probably reincarnated. It's hard to tell at this point how real her mother is. All memoirs involve a bit of mythologizing, and there are times when the words that her mother speaks are so poetic, they beg her belief. It's hard to imagine people really speaking this way. I think it's possible that her mother in this book has become something of a caricature. There's a self-awareness and blind acceptance of Judith's gifts that doesn't always match up. So in the memoir, she describes her mother as kind of saintly, a hero that accepts and believes her gifts and has them herself. In later interviews, her views seem to change. She describes a childhood in which she felt invisible and unimportant to anyone, which doesn't match up with the descriptions of her mother in the memoir.
So did she imply that her mother also had similar gifts?
Yes. So she's telling the story that she starts dreaming of having been in a previous life. And her mom's like, oh, like you were probably here before. And Judith goes, what's that? And she says, well, you see how that violet, that flower, it grows up out of the ground and it blooms and then it dies. And then the next season, they're back again. Things have seasons, which, I mean, look, my people all come from Tennessee, Arkansas, and Oklahoma and like Indian Territory. I mean, people are hardcore conservative Christians and also believe in all kinds of hocus pocus. So I'm not saying that that duality can't exist. Her mother just seemed inconsistent in her character. At one moment, she's very salt of the earth pragmatic, and the next minute, she's very credulous and just like, oh, yes. And as everything has a season. And I'm like, no one talks like that.
Yeah.
No one fucking talks like that.
Yeah.
And I think that what I recognize in Judith's memoir is she's created a narrative and everyone in the book is just a different version of her. And everyone, like, no, she's never in conflict with anyone, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And that's what makes it not real. You have conflicts with people, but everyone in her life seems to just magically say the exact right things. And we'll get into it later. Like, I really kind of tear it apart, but
that's okay. So I find that to be a trait of people who like grew up or who come from a pretty gritty, rough kind of upbringing to sometimes really gloss over things, because if you start to get too into any of the details, the gloss comes off real quick. And so like you just sort of just everything was great and everyone was on board with each other. Because if you start to tell the details of the conflicts are like the people listening have to confront that they have no relation to how your conflicts that are normal to you are completely absurd to them. So it's just, and I think telling for the audience.
Well, I think I'll get into it, but I think when a story is just too perfect, when it fits a formula a little too perfectly, because people's lives don't fit into neat formulas, right? It becomes this giveaway. And like once you start doubting one part of it, then all of it kind of unravels. Like, okay, this is a perfect example. So after high school, Judith wanted to get an education, but her stepfather thought girls were a waste of an education. I just find it hard to believe that her stepfather said that to her. Doesn't it seem a little too perfectly like a Texas dad that's conservative? Like, it just seems a little too on the nose. And these things kept happening in the memoir. I'm like, that's just so on the nose. Huh? And I think it has to do with her trying to downplay her own ambition and her own failure to launch. I see a lot of ego and a lot of places where she's using other people as cover for things that she finds embarrassing. So I think what she finds embarrassing is that she didn't get into a good college. And I think what she finds embarrassing is she didn't finish school. But rather than talk about that, it's everything is everyone else's fault. Like she was trying. So we'll get into this. So after high school, Judith wanted to get an education, but her stepfather thought girls were a waste of an education. Judith had a friend going to university in Lubbock, Texas, and Judith borrowed money from her mother to try to move there. Judith got an apartment, got a job working weekends at the Safeway, and went to the business college there, where she worked to pay her tuition. Her grades weren't that great, but the business college took her. Judith was so poor and overworked that she often went without food, and while she was doing well in her classes, one day she fainted while waiting at a crosswalk and woke up in a hospital. She was suffering from severe malnutrition. She had to leave school and return to her mother's house to recover. What's your over-under on that having actually happened?
Okay. She's working weekends at Safeway. She's going to college. She's pouring overwork. She's going without food. She's doing well in her classes, but she fainted at the crosswalk and woke up in the hospital because she's malnourished. It's not that hard to feed yourself, and if you work at a grocery store, you can get groceries. And
Right.
I just don't, I mean, now that we're in the context of this, now that I am thinking of it through the lens of like questioning her, um, I've been malnourished. I've been very malnourished for a long period of time. And I know how it feels when I'm about to faint. And I know how it feels to go without food. I just feel like if that's not something you're intentionally trying to do, like if you work in a grocery store, you can get nutrition, like you can get something.
Yes. I've been dirt poor, right?
Yeah.
And I can feed myself for a month on $20 if I have to.
Food is not what's hard. Safety and security is what's hard.
Yeah. If you're really, really starving, there are ways that you can buy bulk foods that are very cheap to sustain yourself. But also, I've gone, upwards of 8 days without food before, and I have passed out before. I have fainted before, and you wake up like a second later. You don't wake up in a hospital like that.
Yeah. No.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Every time I fainted, it's just, yeah.
I fainted twice in my life where legit just fainted, lost consciousness, woke up on the floor. And both times, like seconds had passed. It wasn't like I would have been able to have been, someone calls an ambulance comes, takes me to the hospital. They didn't even really have ambulances fully functioning like that in the 60s yet. They didn't, paramedics were still, a cop would show up and put you in the back of a paddy wagon and drive you to the nearest hospital. There wasn't this whole system that, like, people think of things as if they were happening today, but in this, like, when this would be taking place would be the 60s. They didn't even have, paramedics weren't, you would know you were on your way to the hospital. You would be flying around in the back of a paddy wagon being driven by two cops to the hospital, right? And someone would have to call on a landline. All these things that would have to happen.
None of this it just wouldn't have fainted from malnourishment and woken up in a hospital. But if that had been the case, it just seems like there must have been some extra circumstance, because you don't faint from being like, look, you and I are both models who have spent a significant amount of time in Los Angeles. We know what it's like to be hungry and to be starved. Yeah. And I know what it's like to pass out from that shit. You don't wake up in a hospital unless she passed out at the crosswalk and was hit by a car. And that extra information seems like something that she would have shared with us. So anything that would have made that possible would have been probably extra information that she would have definitely included. So that's...
Yeah, it's just like, it's like I enjoyed the memoir at first. I felt like she was a badass and I related to a lot of things in the memoir, but then there would be these stories and they would just, your radar just starts going off. Like, this doesn't quite add up. This is like, again, like I said, wow, that's so perfect.
So what do you think happened?
You were working so hard.
Did she
I think
the hospital? Because
I don't think so.
Because what I read,
that might be what she told her mom so that she could move back in.
Or maybe she wound up at the hospital for reasons, and she said it was just because she's been working so hard that she just didn't even have time to eat.
Yeah.
Think of how many, I don't know, this is a different time, so I don't know if this would be applicable, but like thinking back to young women in the media going to, who are going to a clinic because they're exhausted for exhaustion. They're being treated for exhaustion. Exhaustion is the thing that is their ailment. It's not drugs. It's not mental health. It's not anything else. It's just simply that it's a touch of the vapors, really.
Right. Yeah. I feel like it just seemed a little too on the nose.
Yeah.
It's like, or did you Or was it that you were working and putting yourself through school and it got hard, so you quit and you moved back in with your parents?
Yeah.
Which is a totally normal, completely unshameful thing. But I guess I was wanting to take this apart because I'm wanting the audience to see how narratives are built. So I'm taking us through this memoir kind of step by step to start pointing out the ways that people build narratives so that you can start to recognize it when you're getting fucking conned. So while she's back home, she runs into an old friend from high school named Karis, and they start hanging out, and he professes his love for her, and she knows that she doesn't love him, and she says she doesn't feel the same way, but he asks her to marry him, and he says, well, if you don't believe in love, like, what can it hurt? Because I love you so much. Let's give it a go. And so they went to Juarez, Mexico, and they eloped. Now, she says that pretty quickly, and this comes back to her thing of that after having been sexually assaulted as a young child, it made her very difficult to form relationships with men. And after, I think, seeing what her mom went through, she just didn't have a trust for men. She had a high school sweetheart, and she lost her virginity to him, but they ended up going to different schools. And then, so when she comes back after failing at college, I think probably what happened is she, flunked out of business college and came back home. She runs into this friend, Karis, who hadn't been as popular but felt that now he had access to her because they were out of high school. So she was no longer the popular golden girl. She had kind of come back from a failed experiment with college, and he was still there. And she gave him the time of day because there was no one else around, really. So they elope, they get married. And as soon as they get married, it's that typical thing where he starts drinking all the time. He's cheating on her. It's like not a happy marriage. So she gets pregnant and has a son. And when the son's about a year old, she leaves. She's fed up with him, and she goes back to her mother's house. And while she's at her mother's house, kind of trying to figure out what she's going to do next, she realizes that she's pregnant again. And her mom's like, I think you need to go back to your husband. And so she does. So Karis worked for Shell Oil and had a really good job. They bought a really nice house. They had 2 children. He was still possessive and jealous of her, and life outside the home was limited. She started a business running childcare out of the house and finally had her own money, which she saved up and hid from him. When she caught him having an affair, she finally decided to leave. She says she prayed to God to make her smart and successful as a woman, that she wanted to be important and set an example for her young boys. She had saved $500, which in 1970 was about $4,000 in today's money. That would last you about 1 month in Los Angeles today. I'm sure it would take you a lot further in New Mexico, but with 2 young boys, that is not a lot of money. She only got a few child support payments from her ex-husband of about $37, which today would be about $300, before he stopped paying because he said he couldn't afford it. Now, this one sounds so ridiculous, and I absolutely believe it because my natural father scoffed at paying child support, and it was also it was like $50 a month, and it was like, come on. But no, men will straight up with their full chest claim that paying $37 a month is just destroying they're never going to recover financially from that. So this part I 100% believe. I totally believe that. 100%.
Yeah.
But this does show that she is a self-starter. She sees that she needs to have better clothes. She gets her mom to sew her better clothes. She becomes a majorette to fit in. She tries business school. She fails. She marries this guy. It's not working out. She does something proactive. She leaves. She saves money. So it is telling us what she wants us to know is this is a person that is industrious and looks out for themselves. So she moved back to Roswell in the early 1970s. She was in her late 20s with 2 young children. Keep in mind, the 70s was when the New Age movement really started to pick up steam, as well as the renewed interest in the Roswell incident, aliens, and UFOs. She was desperate for work, so she took a job selling cable television. And the way she described it, it sounds like she was one of those people that would go door to door and try to convince people to sign up for cable TV. She only made commission. She didn't make a base salary, which is why no one wanted the job. So initially she did it and she couldn't sell anything. So then she says that she went back to the office and learned everything about how the cable television business worked and went back out at it and suddenly became like a maestro. She doesn't go into depth here, and I think that's important. What she's leaving out is that she became very good at sales, but she's kind of glossing over that. I just studied everything I could about cable television, and next thing I know, I'm just selling cable TV here and there, and I get promoted. I become like the head marketing associate over my own office, and now I'm making more money than my ex-husband. And what's been left out is that it wasn't. I'm friends with an entrepreneur named Adam Lyons, who you know.
Yes, I love Adam.
And he's in the business of sales and teaching people how to sell and how to market themselves and market their businesses and increase productivity, all of those kinds of things. And if I've learned anything from Adam Lyons, who's probably listening to this podcast, it is that learning everything you can about cable television is not what makes you good at sales. Learning everything you can about sales will make you good at sales. So what she's trying to create here is that she just stumbled into being really good at selling cable television. There's a reason she doesn't want us to focus too much on how she learned to be very good at sales.
Right.
There's a book called How I Raised Myself from Failure to Success in Selling that I just recently read because Adam Lyons recommended it. And it's an entire book on how to be good at sales. And not once does it mention knowing everything about your product. I think it mentions it like once or twice. It's good to know those things. But I would say 85% of the book is about how people's minds work and what makes them want to purchase a product, what makes them a loyal customer, and how to network and how to read people and figure out what they need and then meet that need and make them feel like it was their idea. So I thought it was really significant that she kind of glosses over like something pretty important, right?
Yeah, that's
which is
pretty strong skill set that she is.
Because what she's kind of, like I think she's trying to make it seem like she prayed to God and God kind of supernaturally just conferred success upon her. And like, but don't look at like the sales part, right? But that was like, so you hear voices, you've gotten really good at sales. I wonder where this is going. And it's the 70s and it's the height of the New Age movement. And you're hearing voices and you're good at sales.
Oh, good golly.
I wonder how this is going to come together. Like, anyway. So a few months later, she's promoted as a director of marketing for Southern California. She moves her family to Manhattan Beach, hires a nanny. She's doing well. Here, again, she doesn't explain how she does this. She teaches her team her own form of sales and boosted sales for the entire company. She doesn't say what that form of sales was or what that system was. And I think there's a reason why she doesn't tell us that, because she's doing it right now.
Okay, so she's still selling cable, right?
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, in the book, she doesn't tell us what her form of sales was that she taught her team that just was so magical. And okay. I think she didn't tell us what that form of sales was because she's doing that form of sales.
Still selling it to this very day. Yes. And we're still consuming. Yes.
So it's during this time that she received a new name. her boss didn't like the name Judy, and he thought that Mrs. Hensley was too formal. So this story's also changed. So in the memoir, Judith says that at her old job, when she was still back in New Mexico, like her old sales team used to call her Zebra. She liked to wear black and white clothing a lot. Now, other people say they called her Zebra because she was able to see everything in black and white.
Yeah.
So even something as simple as like, where did your name come from, has this like, is on shifting ground. It's like, was it because you're really good at making decisions, or is it because you just had a propensity for dressing in black and white? I'm more inclined to believe that it was because she wore a lot of black and white clothing. Like, she's someone that we'll see later is prone to eccentricity. So I'm more likely to believe it was that. And so he thought Zebra was too funny. And so he was like, why don't we call you Jay-Z? And she was like, okay. And so her name became Jay-Z. Everyone called her Jay-Z. So around this time, her and a coworker went to go see a psychic. The woman was Indian. It's unclear whether she meant Indian or Native American, but I'm going to assume this is written in the 80s, New Age, all the things. I'm going to assume she means Native American, but I could be wrong. She could also mean Indian. So she doesn't specify. I will say that in some stories, this wasn't in her memoir, but in some stories, it's a Yaqui woman tells her mother when Judith is a baby, like, oh, your child is blessed with great knowledge. Because of course, there has to be a magical Negro that enters the storyline and provides guidance. She goes to the psychic, and the psychic tells her about her marriage, her children, her job, and then predicts that she's going to have a choice between two options for work, that one is going to be in the mountains and the other one is going to be in a city that is, the sky is dark with work or dark with business. But if she goes to the place in the mountains, she will meet the one, she will find the enlightened one. A few weeks later, her boss offers her own franchise, either in Pennsylvania or Tacoma. Pennsylvania, with the sky is full of industrial smoke and smog, so dark with business. And then Tacoma, Washington, is a suburb of Seattle that is very green, and it's in the mountains. Yes. She chose Tacoma. So, most of us have instances in our lives where something paranormal or extraordinary happens, a dream of something that later comes true, weird coincidences, seeing strange things. For most of us, these are briefly fascinating, but we don't use them to justify the direction of our lives. It's also interesting in her memoir to watch her mythologizing herself in the world building. In Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces, he highlights the beats of the hero's journey, and we can see it at play in her narrative. I'm going to list them out so you can look at them as the narrative continues. So the hero's journey is also known as the monomyth. It's a narrative pattern that appears in various myths, legends, and stories from different cultures around the world. The hero's journey outlines a common structure that many hero-centered stories follow, involving a protagonist who embarks on a transformative adventure. The traditional beats are as follows. The call to adventure. The hero is introduced to a situation that disrupts their ordinary life and presents a challenge or opportunity. This call to adventure may come from an external source or arise from within the hero themselves. Refusal of the call. Initially, the hero may hesitate or resist answering the call due to fear, self-doubt, or a desire to maintain their comfortable, familiar life. Meeting the mentor. The hero encounters a wise figure, mentor, or supernatural aid who provides guidance, advice, or assistance. The mentor equips the hero with the tools, knowledge, or encouragement needed for the journey. Crossing the threshold. The hero makes a conscious decision to leave their ordinary world and enter into the unknown, embarking on the adventure. This crossing of the threshold signifies the hero's commitment to their journey and marks the beginning of their transformation. Tests, allies, and enemies. The hero faces a series of trials, encounters allies who assist them, and encounters enemies or obstacles that they must overcome. These challenges test the hero's abilities, character, and determination, helping them grow and develop. Approach to the inmost cave. The hero moves closer to the central challenge or goal of their journey. This stage represents a critical moment of preparation and anticipation before confronting the main obstacle or enemy. Ordeal and reward. The hero faces their greatest challenge, often a life-threatening situation or intense confrontation. They undergo a significant transformation or gain a valuable insight. Overcoming this ordeal brings a reward of treasure, which can be both literal and symbolic. The road back. Having achieved their goal or acquired newfound knowledge, the hero begins their journey back to the ordinary world. This stage may involve further challenges or a realization of the consequences of their actions. Resurrection. The hero faces a final test, often a climactic battle or confrontation, which symbolizes their ultimate transformation or rebirth. They emerge stronger, wiser, and changed. Return with the elixir. The hero returns to their ordinary world, bringing back the reward, wisdom, or gift obtained during their journey. They use this newfound knowledge or power to benefit themselves and others. So in just going through that, do you see kind of what I was hinting at earlier, where as you go through this memoir, certain things just seemed to just be right in place? Like she had drawn out a story map of the hero's journey and just started filling it in with these moments, like just dropping them in to the narrative.
Yes.
And this is where,
Yeah, and just for a little extra context, because you and I are very familiar with the hero's journey, very, very familiar. However, if you're not familiar with it, the hero's journey basically is the formula for pretty much every epic story that you're familiar with. So Star Wars follows the hero's journey. Like any major story, it's just the sort of observation of how these arcs work out when we tell narratives about heroes typically, and it's the commonality that we see in a lot of these stories. So this is something that this isn't like when Sovereign referenced like the hero's journey. This isn't Joseph Campbell's niche cool blog that nobody's heard of before. This is like something that she is very much clearly aware of and using to construct her own epic narrative behind her.
Yeah. And it's worth saying that there was a really famous PBS documentary that involved Joseph Campbell sitting down with an interviewer, and George Lucas is in it and others, and he breaks down the hero's journey. And I think it was a 12-part series where he breaks down each one. So if you want to, and you're interested in what we're talking about, you can go look it up. It's on YouTube for free. It's an old PBS documentary, but it also came out in like the early 80s, and she wrote her memoir in 88. So the hero's journey, that he wrote a book called A Hero with a Thousand Faces. And again, this is a book that became super popular after the popularity of Star Wars because George Lucas was talking so much about Joseph Campbell and using that. And so Joseph Campbell was an anthropologist, and George Lucas and the popularity of Star Wars sort of drug him out of academic obscurity. Within the academic circles, people knew who he was, but George Lucas really brought that into mainstream popular culture. And so the hero's journey was getting really popular like right before she wrote this book. And one of the themes is that she's sort of like Thomas Jefferson, where there's that famous quote about Thomas Jefferson that he was most heavily influenced by whatever book he had just read. Many times, people in her inner circle later talked about the fact that she's a very voracious reader and very good, and is known for having a sort of a photographic memory and being able to incorporate and pull in concepts and turn them around and spew them out back at people and make it sound like she just thought of it. Mm-hmm. I mean, look, half of me is so proud of her. The hoe half of me, it's like within all of us, there are two wolves, Uh-huh. And while fraud is bad, good hoe hustle is something I respect,
It's a craft, it's an art form, I would say. It's
poetry.
Yes.
It pure poetry in motion. Poetry in motion.
It is. And
all right.
Yeah. I kind of relate to some of it. I mean, the hoe in me really does.
I mean, this is what ill repute is about. It's about pulling women up and going like, it's not just, oh, here's the good. It's like, here's the great. Here's the fantastic. Okay. So in 1973, the cable company she was working for collapsed. She decided to start her own company. She hired a team and trained them. Again, she doesn't tell us what her special method is for sales. And by the time she's writing this memoir, she's not writing this memoir as a saleswoman. So there's no reason for her to be like holding on to this proprietary information about how she sells, other than the fact that we're not supposed to think about the fact that she's coming from sales.
Yeah.
She's a salesperson,
She's
right?
shilling things.
She's shilling things. Exactly. She says, and here's where she starts to build up this thing. She said she had a reputation for just knowing where to send her people to go canvas to. So I'm assuming, again, this was people doing door-to-door cold sales, like cold calling and trying to get people to sign up for cable. And she tells these stories that, one of her team members would have no one was wanting to buy, and she would magically just know what neighborhood to send them to, and they would suddenly rack up all of these sales. So she's kind of laying this groundwork for like, she's touched, she just knows, there's something about her that's special, but she doesn't think anything of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really important tone that came through in the whole book, is everything she's doing, she's just stumbling into it like Mr. Magoo with just really thick glasses on, like, and everything just works out though.
Yeah.
So despite her success, she gets ill again and finds herself in the hospital again. And she's diagnosed with degenerative mononucleosis and a virus that was attacking her white blood cells, and was put into chemotherapy.
They do chemo for mono?
Well, apparently she also had some kind of a virus that was attacking her white blood cells.
What kind of virus?
She doesn't say. They couldn't figure it out, but they had her on chemo.
For a virus?
Again,
I didn't know
right?
they did that. Huh?
I didn't either. It seems a little...
That's a lot. That's crazy.
That's
wild that happened to her. That must be a lot to deal with for her. I can't imagine.
That, again, this is one of those things that beggars belief. And I think where she's going with this is that there's a kind of common trope in New Age stuff that having psychic gifts or being able to perform different feats is very draining and taxing on the body if you're not prepared, if you haven't reached enlightenment yet. Your brain can't handle. And I think what she's trying to do here is hint at this idea that she has these abilities, but because she doesn't know how to use them yet, her system is constantly being compromised. I find it hard to believe that they just had her on chemo for something they didn't know what it was. Because I'm like, it's you either have cancer or you have HIV. If things are attacking your white blood cells.
Yeah. Do they use chemo for HIV?
I don't know enough about how they treated HIV in the 70s. I don't know enough about medical care in general in the 70s. I know that we were still kind of figuring out what paramedics were supposed to do still. I don't have a lot of reference. So very well, maybe that was just something they attacked everything with. I don't know.
Like, fuck it. I guess, like, in a time when they could just throw treatment at something willy-nilly, and I guess they just did that back then and they afforded it, no problem.
Yeah. I found it kind of hard to believe because she talks about she became despondent. They couldn't figure out what was going on with her. And like one of her employees was really worried about her and wanted to like take her to an evangelical preacher there was an evangelist that was doing some kind of an event, like a revival in a tent kind of thing. And one of her employees convinced her to go with him and his wife to see this healer that was supposedly able to heal people. I didn't see anyone that had talked to anyone that used to I really looked too for anyone that at this time, that had worked under her that could confirm whether or not she was actually that sick. But I know that when people go through chemo, they're not going into like the office every day. I mean, people do have to work, right? If you have mono and you're being aggressively treated with chemotherapy for an unknown virus that's attacking your white blood cells, I don't think you're going into the office.
It doesn't seem like you would.
If you have mono and you're doing chemo, but you are going to be able to like get up, go outside, go get in a car and drive to like a revival. It's another place where I call malingering. I find it hard to believe that a psychic got her things right and she had an unknown virus attacking her white blood cells and she was so malnourished she ended up in the hospital it's just like, wow, that's like a lot of stuff.
Like you were saying, it really seems like she's trying to illustrate that she is but a vessel of this world that is not capable of contending with this otherworldly force that works through her. So her fragile human body gets sent to the hospital because she's just not able to, to contend with these big powers that are moving through her. Just little old her who doesn't know, what to do about any of it. But I hear what you're saying. Okay, so she goes, and by the way, if I'm faking all this shit and I'm in the hospital, which I don't know if she was, I don't know if she actually got chemotherapy or she just said that she got chemotherapy. That seems hard to fake. It seems hard to fake something enough that doctors would give you unnecessary chemo. It seems like that's an illustration to her story.
Yeah, I don't think she was put on chemo. I don't think she had a mystery virus. I think I just have a hard time believing in any of this story. I don't know if any of it's real. Well, okay, so she goes to the revival, and despite the odds, the preacher picks her out of the crowd to heal. What are the odds?
You don't say.
While he touched her, a flash of blue light appeared at the top of the tent like lightning and went down through her body and knocked the preacher to the ground. Mm. If this is starting to sound a little bit out there, strap in. Shit's about to get...
Is this her report or did literally anybody else?
This is her report.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's crazy.
It just seems like that's an event that a lot of people would remember and would be like, oh, yeah, I was there.
So were there any witness accounts?
None that I've found. And 2020 did a profile of her and didn't interview any of
we're not and able to make it
because I think it was made up.
Yes.
I think she made it up.
Yes, I think you're right.
I don't think there was a revival. I don't think any of that. So apparently after this happens, she miraculously gets better.
Well, if you're in that hospital, if she's faking this illness, then as soon as someone says, hey, I know a preacher, if I'm that charlatan, I'm going to be like, oh, thank God, get me out of this room. As soon as he touches me, I'm going to be cured. I want to do something else now.
Yes. I think maybe if she fainted and ended up in the hospital, she strikes me as someone that courts attention. And I think that you're right, that I'm going to try this on. I'm going to be really sick and as a way of just getting attention. And then, oh, look, I'm magically healed.
Or, it could be that she's got some actual sickness that is so mundane. It's tragic. So she has to, she's actually got something that is very, necessarily putting her in the hospital, but she doesn't want to admit to it because it's too fucking boring for her wild narrative that she's crafting. I don't know.
Yeah.
Could be anything.
I mean, I think it's just that thing where when someone's always the most special, always the most sick, always the most put upon, always the most righteous, because that's not how people are. No one's a monolith.
Yes.
Well, except for Jay-Z.
And that's why she's so special, and that's why we're talking about her.
Yeah. Yeah.
The exception that proves the rule.
Yeah. So in 1977, she met a dentist named Jeremy Wilder and became a housewife. There's not a lot of talk about what happened to her business. I guess she just suddenly gave it up, or it's not clear. She was 27. Her boys were 10 and 8. Jeremy would often take her to dinner parties where the subject of the paranormal and New Age spirituality would come up often. So I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and it is to a degree both a frontier culture and a place of wealth. There are a lot of people that migrate up to the Northwest for the natural beauty and to engage in their alternative spiritual practices. Washington, the Pacific Northwest, is very amenable to woo.
Yes.
It's a very amenable to woo. When I was a kid, there was a big thing over these bumper stickers that said "Proud to be a native Oregonian," and they were in response to this surge of people that moved up from into Northern California and across the border into Oregon to create these little communes, to engage in woo. And they were generally very wealthy, and they would come in and they would buy up all of this real estate, and native Oregonians couldn't stand them. And so for a while, these bumper stickers were this thing that people would, to try to distinguish themselves from the crazy California people that were coming up with all their weird ideas. And so her and her husband were hikers, and they hung out with she basically married up. She married this dentist, and I guess at that time, dentists made a lot of money, and she became a housewife and was now going to dinner parties and going on hikes and talking about woo. So in 1977, she's at one of these dinner parties, and the people were talking about pyramid power. Do you want to talk about pyramid power?
Pyramid power is a term that emerged in the 1970s associated with the belief in the alleged mystical properties and powers attributed to pyramidal structures, particularly when scaled-down models or replicas of pyramids are used. Proponents of pyramid power claim that pyramids have the ability to harness and amplify various energies, including spiritual, healing, and supernatural forces. Advocates believe that the unique shape and geometry of pyramids generate a specific energy field or vibration that can affect physical and metaphysical phenomena. Some proponents suggest that the exposure to pyramid structures or objects can promote physical healing, enhance meditation and spiritual experiences, and preserve or enhance the potency of organic materials like food or water. Pyramids are often used as meditation aids, with the belief that their shape helps to focus and direct energy, enhancing the depth and effectiveness of meditation practices. Pyramid power has also been associated with claims of enhancing psychic abilities such as telepathy, clairvoyance, and telekinesis. During the 70s, various experiments were conducted to investigate the potential effects of pyramid power. Some studies claimed positive results, while others were inconclusive or debunked the claims. Pyramid power is not scientifically supported, and there is a lack of empirical evidence to substantiate the claims made by its proponents. Many of the experiments conducted in the past failed to demonstrate any consistent or measurable effects associated with pyramid power. You don't fucking say. Oh, my stars.
I had heard the term pyramid power before, but obviously by the time I came on the scene, it was like not something people were doing anymore. I mean, obviously to this day, in spiritual context, metaphysical context, alternative culture context, pyramids are still triangles and pyramids, sacred geometry. To a lesser degree, that kind of thinking has been folded into more mainstream thinking. We just have things like sacred geometry, right?
Yeah,
like
sacred geometry and all of that. There's a rule of three. But then there's also like having an action figure of the cool pyramid in Egypt, and it's like the one that you keep at home that gives you like fancy psychic vibrations.
Like it just apparently it was supposed to help like preserve food, all kinds of stuff. You would construct the framework of a pyramid, and then you would put the food or the wine or whatever, and it was supposed to enhance its properties.
We had the food pyramid. Is there any connection to metaphysics? And
other than it's bullshit?
Yes, like, complete and utter bullshit. Like growing up, did you get the Pyramid Collection catalog?
No.
Okay, it was this catalog that was just like super, it's woo, it's all the spiritual shit. It's like grown up. Some of it was a little bit goth adjacent. So like some of the dresses were overpriced and very gothy, but it had all kinds of pyramid things, anything that you would find in the New Age section of Barnes & Noble. Like it was there. They also had sex toys that quote unquote weren't sex toys. And they
personal massagers.
Yeah, but they were like breaking their arms, patting themselves on the back for how clever they were about their own terminology around it. It was great. I just didn't realize that like pyramid power, like that people actually just held on to pyramids. I didn't realize that it was so like, just so like tangible, like so, I don't know.
I'm going to get into that. I'm going to get into like why that happened. After this dinner party, Jay-Z's life would be changed forever. She went and got a bunch of books on pyramids at the request of her husband. So in her memoir, she says her husband became very fascinated by this idea. He told her, go get a bunch of books on pyramids. And so she did. And then apparently they stayed up for like a couple days over the weekend, like making pyramids at like exact to spec and like putting them all over the house, putting them on everything, kind of as a joke, just to see if it worked, like just to give it a whirl. I was listening to another podcast and someone forwarded the idea, and I was like, I couldn't believe I missed it. Yeah, cocaine was really good in the 70s, wasn't it? And I was like, oh, when I look back at it like that, when I started watching a lot of David Icke stuff and Alex Jones before the white supremacy, this was like in 2008, 2004, when I started to get really into that stuff, I also had a mean meth habit and I could convince myself just about anything was true. And it really hit me that I saw two things happening here. She says, my husband says to go buy these books. He's really interested in it. Then we spend a couple days making pyramids, just kind of having fun, not really thinking anything of it. I'm thinking, or a saleswoman was sitting at a dinner party and heard all these people talking about pyramid power and how much they believed in it. And she went, wow, people are really fucking stupid. How can I make this work for me?
Mm-hmm.
So apparently, 1977, they spent a couple days making pyramids. And as a joke, she takes one of the pyramids and she puts it on her head. And she says, if these things work, make me the smartest person ever. And something happens. She goes into a trance and a mystical being appeared to her, calling himself Ramtha. He was 7 feet tall with copper skin and purple robes bathed in light. She knew immediately he was benevolent and safe. And he told her, I am Ramtha, the enlightened one, and I'm here to help you over the ditch. After she came out of her trance, she told her husband what happened. Rather than being shocked, he was intrigued.
Okay. He wasn't shocked at all, though? Like, not even a little bit?
Completely credulous. Completely credulous. She puts a pyramid on her head, and a 7-foot spiritual entity calling itself Ramtha appeared to her and said, I am here to help you over the ditch.
Over the ditch. No, he didn't. He wasn't like, what ditch? He was just like, Ramtha and that fucking ditch again. Always about the ditch with Ramtha. Obviously. Okay. I'm glad you met fucking Copper Ramtha too.
I wrote this into the script because I knew we would be here. This seems like a good point to take a break and talk about the history of the New Age movement. Okay, so the New Age movement is a broad and diverse spiritual and metaphysical movement that emerged in the Western world in the late 20th century. It encompasses a wide range of beliefs, practices, and philosophies that integrate elements from various spiritual and religious traditions, as well as alternative and esoteric concepts. The New Age movement is characterized by its emphasis on personal spiritual growth, self-realization, holistic healing, and the exploration of consciousness. It often incorporates ideas related to metaphysics, esotericism, mysticism, Eastern spirituality, indigenous wisdom, astrology, alternative medicine, and environmentalism.
Key concepts within the New Age movement include consciousness expansion. The New Age movement promotes the idea that individuals can transcend their limited perspectives and achieve higher states of consciousness through meditation, visualization, and other spiritual practices. Interconnectedness. New Agers often emphasize the interconnectedness of all beings and the unity of the universe. This perspective promotes a holistic and ecological worldview that recognizes the interdependence of humans, nature, and the cosmos. Self-empowerment and personal transformation. The movement encourages individuals to take an active role in their own spiritual development and personal growth. It promotes the belief that individuals have the power to shape their reality and manifest their desires through positive thinking and intention. Alternative healing modalities. New Age practices often incorporate various forms of alternative healing, such as energy healing, crystal therapy, aromatherapy, and other holistic approaches aimed at promoting physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being. And spiritual pluralism. New Agers tend to embrace a syncretic approach, drawing inspiration from multiple spiritual traditions and belief systems. They may blend elements of Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, Native American spirituality, and other religious or spiritual practices. And having read that, I felt like I was reading myself really hard. It's all alternative healing. I'm just like, yeah, consciousness expansion and interconnectedness and oh, fuck me. I've become that guy, haven't I?
Well, I wanted to contextualize where we're at. So this is like the 70s, and you have to think about what's going on culturally, which is the Vietnam War was a super unpopular war. You had the civil rights movement, you had the Summer of Love. Going into the 70s, everything was about obliterating institutions. And of course, that was going to apply to religion, where it was this time when people were open to this new way of thinking, because what they had just figured out was that institutions lie to you. They keep secrets, right? Vietnam was a very unpopular war. When Walter Cronkite finally made the decision to actually just show what was going on over there, and it shocked everyone into hating the Vietnam War and like demanding that we pull out, because media and the government had been lying and hiding the violence and the slaughter that was going on there. And when Walter Cronkite essentially decided that it was time for the American public to see what was actually going on, it obliterated it. So that distrust of the government, this desire to find new ways, questioning institutions. So people were very credulous. They were open and willing to believe this shit. You know, they wanted to put their faith in new systems. They wanted to create new systems. And so I think that is a lot of where, you know, New Age philosophy emerged from. And I think it started in a place that was a place of genuine curiosity, but it also very quickly became a breeding ground for all kinds of fraud and just basic foolishness.
So when I read this stuff, I think that a lot of people in this New Age movement really are sincere and earnest in that they want to explore their own consciousness, and they probably like doing some cool drugs sometimes that let them explore that a little bit in ways they didn't realize they could. And those drugs kind of really do make you feel a sense of connectedness and unity and everything. And it really does put you into this sort of self-reflective place, and it can be a really cool space. When you're in that place and you're self-reflective and you're sort of opening up your mind to new ideas and reframing the way that you think, it's very, very easy for literally anyone to swoop in and seed that fertile ground in your mind and decide that like this person is so ripe for grooming into manipulating into whatever I want them to be.
Yeah.
It can be a really great place on a personal level to explore yourself, but it also is as a movement and as a community. Anytime you have someone who is in a vulnerable place, there will be people eager to victimize them.
Yeah. And you have to also look at New Age stuff tends to be very solipsistic. It's very much about self-actualization. It's very internal. The thing that it lacks from traditional religion is very much rooted in community. And New Age philosophy kind of turned that on its head, where everything becoming incredibly self-centered and very inwardly focused. And that also creates its own issues, you know, and especially when you get people focusing inward on self-actualization, you can keep them running in a hamster wheel forever because no one ever becomes actualized.
No one actually reaches nirvana. It's not a real thing. Yeah. And the spiritual pluralism, the way that it sort of blends elements of different religions, I think that is also a testament. It's also a sort of a symptom of that individualism. It's people who have rejected the systems through which the lenses through which they saw the world religiously, but they hold on to some of the sentiment that, you know, like I'm not a Christian, but the way I learned to talk about these things has a real Christian flavor to it. So like there's elements of Christianity and Buddhism and like bringing parts of what you are trying to leave behind. They're just coming with you because it's like it's the same way it's like, oh, is that like this other religion's Bible? It's not. No, the Bible is your Bible. That's their book is their book. But that framework, that wording, that I think it just bleeds into it.
when the constant refrain, just like take what resonates and leave the rest.
Yes.
And it's like, no, it's like, it's part of a system. Reincarnation. Yeah. It's like, well, actually reincarnation is also part of like this caste system. Like the concept of reincarnation fits into a context, a larger social context in certain religions. Right. And like, you can't just take one part. That one part is justifying all these other parts, that it's part of a system. Like you actually do have to take the whole system. So I think there's also that too, that kind of piecemealing things together into like your own Frankenstein belief system. And I'm not here to shit on anyone's belief system. I have crystals. I have a pyramid at my house by my laptop. I read my horoscope, and those things are fun for me. I enjoy them. I wouldn't base the trajectory of my life on those things.
I'm here to shit on every belief system. You're full of shit and you're stupid and it's time to get over it. Get a job already. Dance.
So it's not hard to see how the New Age movement has insinuated itself into nearly every aspect of our lives, from food being certified as organic at the grocery store to pickup culture advocating ideas like the divine masculine and feminine, and in the current popularity of manifesting. There's a great documentary by my spiritual father, Adam Curtis, called Century of the Self. It's available on YouTube and was seminal in shaping my worldview. It examines in depth how self-actualization and the New Age movement coincided with a greater spiritual crisis in the modern era. It's about 6 hours long, and it's more comprehensive than what I could get into here, but it's worth a watch if you're interested in more analysis of the impact of the New Age movement on our daily lives. Like other religious movements, there's been a lot of mythologizing in the New Age movement and certain tropes that you'll be familiar with even if you don't know what they're talking about. The New Age movement often looks to ancient civilizations such as Atlantis, Lemuria, and ancient Egypt as sources of esoteric knowledge and spiritual wisdom. These lost civilizations are seen as having possessed advanced spiritual and technological understanding, which New Agers seek to rediscover and integrate into their lives. New Agers frequently draw upon archetypes and mythic figures from various mythologies as symbols and guides for personal and spiritual growth. These may include figures like the goddess, the hero, the wise sage, or mythical beings from different cultures.
This just sounds like white people. This just sounds like describing appropriation. This is just cultural appropriation, but like, let's study it anthropologically. It's just like pulling, and that's what we do. That's what, every culture is, but it's just interesting.
The concept of ascended masters is prominent in the New Age movement. Ascended masters are believed to be highly evolved spiritual beings who have transcended the cycle of reincarnation and are available to guide and teach humanity. These masters are often associated with different spiritual traditions, such as Jesus, Buddha, and various other enlightened figures. I think Ramtha qualifies as our ascended master here.
Yeah.
The New Age movement incorporates cosmological and planetary mythology, viewing the cosmos and celestial bodies as embodiments of spiritual energies and consciousness. Concepts like astrology, the zodiac, and planetary influences are often used to interpret and understand personal and collective experiences. Creation myths from different cultures are explored and interpreted within the New Age movement to understand the origins and nature of existence. Sacred symbols such as the yin-yang, the labyrinth, or the tree of life are also utilized as representations of cosmic harmony, interconnectedness, and spiritual principles. New Agers often acknowledge the presence and influence of elemental and nature spirits such as fairies, devas, or spirit animals. These beings are believed to inhabit and hold sacred energy within the natural world, promoting a reverence for nature and ecological awareness. It's important to note there has been a lot of criticism of the New Age movement. Many view its pan-indigenous, pan-spiritual approach as an example of white appropriation. A stark example of this is the concept of a spirit animal. While some feel you shouldn't use the term because it's offensive to Native people, many Native people have pointed out that the reason spirit animal is offensive is not because it's appropriative, but because it's transcribing to them a belief they don't have. There may be syncretic beliefs in some Native cultures, but as the concept is understood by those who use it, it doesn't exist. I've included this indigenous creator on TikTok talking about.
Are y'all offended when white people say, like, these things are my spirit animal?
Yes, but not in the way that you think. Now, you have to understand that linguistically, we're just not the same. That a lot of terms that are synonymous with indigenous people were not ones of our own, like the word chief or tribe. These are very clearly English words, and yet they've become synonymous with indigenous people of this land. And this is one of those things. It was something that was forced upon us, this term spirit animal. And the reality is we don't have such a thing. I mean, you have to understand that every culture, regardless of wherever they're from, is molded and lives their life by the law of the land of which they occupy. This can include our clanships, in which we will use those names of those animals to identify with, like the Bear Clan. And due to the rise of popularity of paganism and New Ageism, they started using those terms, which then got forced onto us, because apparently we're the same. So it's offensive in the fact that everyone thinks that it's us, but it's not.
New Age beliefs also make it easy to con people. There are several online message boards and Facebook groups devoted to exposing fraudulent gurus and healers. Many of them claim native knowledge or initiation to perpetuate their harms. And that's that's a really big thing. And gurus became popular really in the 60s and 70s, and they would be actual Indian people that would come over, or people would go to India and they would study with a guru in an ashram and things like that. But what started to happen, and what is continually a problem now, and this really got into the 70s and 80s, the idea of sort of white shamans that would claim they had been initiated into different Native American tribal practices, or that had studied under different gurus and now they're the guru. It started to get very appropriative and very icky. And there weren't a lot of places where people could investigate whether or not those credentials were real. And so even to this day, there are message boards and groups that are dedicated to basically indexing false prophets, fake shamans, fake medicine men, people that are claiming to be indigenous or have indigenous acceptance that are lying. It's called pretendianism. It's a really big problem. It's also a big problem in academia. A big part of that has to do with this idea of spiritual pluralism and how it's devolved into a lot of appropriative spiritual language to clothe naked capitalism. Yeah. Because when you look at a lot of these religious groups or New Age groups, the goal tends to be incredibly material. Manifest your dream job, manifest a big house, manifest incredible wealth. It's seed faith. It's the same appeal as charismatic Pentecostal preachers with name it and claim it, seed faith.
I'm not familiar.
Seed faith is you sow a certain amount of your income with the church, and then it will come back to you tenfold. So that's seed faith. And then name it and claim it is, again, the same thing. By calling it into existence, it will come into existence. It's this way of making you exclusively responsible for everything that happens to you. But what it also makes clear is that the main end goal of a lot of these New Age philosophies seems to be winning at capitalism.
Yeah.
That's the ultimate end goal, which is how it sort of exposes itself as fraudulent. Self-actualization becomes defined as having a lot of material stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which should seem antithetical.
Yes, absolutely.
And this idea that spiritual wholeness or cleanliness can be seen by how successful someone is financially. The guru should be driving a Mercedes-Benz. The guru should be in a mansion because they're so ascended and special. They have so much power. And when you sit back and look at that, it just doesn't really make a lot of sense. The more ascended they are, the less they should crave those things or want them.
Any system where impoverished people are defending a wealthy person for being wealthy, especially like someone who's their leader, it's just like, it's so far gone.
Yeah.
They can't even question the things that are holding them down because they're so bought into being repressed under them. I don't know. It's just very sad.
Yeah. So two of the big mythical civilizations that exist in New Age culture are Lemuria and Atlantis. Have you heard of Mu or Lemuria?
I have not. So I'm very familiar with Atlantis, but Lemuria and Mu are new to me. So...
Okay, so I'll break it down. So Lemuria, also known as Mu, is a hypothetical lost continent that has been part of various esoteric and New Age beliefs. It is often considered a legendary civilization that predates recorded history and is associated with advanced spiritual and technological knowledge. The concept of Lemuria was popularized in the 19th century by British zoologist and biologist Philip Slater. He proposed the idea of a land bridge called Lemuria to explain the distribution of lemurs across India and Madagascar. However, Slater's theory was eventually replaced by the theory of continental drift and plate tectonics. In the realm of esoteric and New Age beliefs, Lemuria is seen as a highly evolved and spiritually advanced civilization that existed before Atlantis and other ancient civilizations. It is often portrayed as a harmonious and peaceful society with inhabitants possessing heightened psychic abilities and deep spiritual understanding. According to some interpretations, Lemuria was thought to have been located in the Pacific Ocean, covering areas such as present-day regions of Hawaii, Polynesia, and parts of the Indian Ocean. It is believed that the continent was destroyed or submerged due to cataclysmic events similar to the fate of Atlantis. Lemuria is associated with themes of lost knowledge, ancient wisdom, and the search for spiritual enlightenment. Some New Age followers believe that remnants of Lemurian culture and teachings can still be accessed and integrated into modern spiritual practices.
I'm shocked that I haven't heard of this.
I've heard of it vague. It's sort of like, this is important because Ramtha.
Because Ramtha.
So Lemuria is kind of supposed to be what was before Atlantis, and then Lemurians had to pilgrimage to Atlantis and were like expatriates in Atlantis when Lemuria was destroyed. And then Atlantis turns around and is destroyed. So for those that don't know about Atlantis, and some people might not, so Atlantis is a legendary island or continent mentioned in the works of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. According to Plato's dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, am I getting that right?
Timaeus sounds right. You know what? Who fucking cares?
Critias. Atlantis was an advanced civilization that existed around 9,000 years before his time. It was said to be a powerful and prosperous society located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, often identified with the Strait of Gibraltar. The story of Atlantis became popular primarily due to the writings of Plato himself. He described Atlantis as highly advanced civilization with great technological achievements, an organized social structure, and strong military. However, Atlantis became corrupted by its materialistic and arrogant tendencies, leading to its eventual downfall. Plato's account portrays Atlantis as a cautionary tale about the consequences of hubris and the impermanence of human achievements. Plato's dialogues were influential in shaping Western philosophy and literature, and the story of Atlantis intrigued readers and thinkers throughout history. The fascination with Atlantis was further fueled by the Renaissance period, when there was a renewed interest in ancient Greek philosophy and mythology. Scholars and explorers sought to interpret Plato's account of Atlantis literally and began speculating about its location and historical authenticity. Over time, numerous theories and hypotheses about the existence and location of Atlantis emerged, although none have been conclusively proven. The story of Atlantis has become a symbol of a lost utopian civilization, a subject of speculation and debate, and a source of inspiration for tales of submerged cities and mysterious realms. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Theosophy, an influential spiritual movement that contributed to the development of the New Age movement, explored the idea of Atlantis as a lost and advanced civilization. The Theosophical Society, founded by Helena Blavatsky, proposed that Atlantis was a real place with highly evolved beings and esoteric knowledge. This idea resonated with the New Age movement's emphasis on hidden wisdom and spiritual evolution. Furthermore, as the New Age movement gained popularity in the latter half of the 20th century, writers and channelers began incorporating the concept of Atlantis into their teachings and narratives. Channelers, who claimed to receive information from spiritual entities, often portrayed Atlantis as a source of ancient wisdom and a blueprint for a more enlightened society. Moreover, the allure of Atlantis as a symbol of a forgotten golden age or a future paradigm shift resonates with the New Age movement's vision of personal and collective transformation, as well as the exploration of alternative realities and dimensions. This may seem a little daunting. I'm just trying to ease you all in. My mother became an adherent of the Course in Miracles. So I grew up being told nothing real can be threatened and nothing unreal can exist when I had any kind of problems. It was like being dropped into the metaphysical shit as a child, but it's pretty easy for me to wade through the spiritual morass because of it.
Nothing real can be threatened and nothing unreal can exist.
Unreal exist, yeah.
Okay, what does that mean?
I don't know.
Because that fixes
I don't
nothing.
know.
That fixes nothing. That solves nothing.
It means if something is real, then it cannot be destroyed, threatened, taken away, moved, right? It exists. It is simply there, right? And nothing unreal exists. So let's say I have a problem. I'm worried about XYZ. And it's like, well, if XYZ is real, nothing can destroy it. If XYZ can be destroyed, then it's not real and it doesn't matter anyway. Which is kind of like a different version of saying, like, I would put it like, I don't believe in unrequited love because In order to love someone, they have to love you back. To truly love someone, they have to love you back because they have to return that feeling enough for you to see who they really are. To have full access to someone, they must love you. Only once they're open to you in that way do you see who they really are. And then only then can you actually be in love with them. So unrequited love is actually just envy, desire, jealousy, insecurity. If you don't love me back, there's no way I can know you well enough to say I love you and have that be a true statement. I can really like you. I can really like what I know of you, but I cannot actually be in love with you unless you are in love with me, because love is an experience you are having together. So unrequited love is an oxymoron. Love is not a thing. It's a state of being. It's an action. It doesn't exist in a static way. It's a dynamic. It's a relationship.
Yes.
So you can't have unrequited love for someone that doesn't love you back, because love is something you do together.
That is fascinating. I've never heard that perspective, but I really like it and I appreciate it.
So that would be nothing real can be threatened, nothing real exists.
Okay.
I should take over for Marianne Williamson. So why did we devolve into all of this? It's important to have context for what the 70s was like. So everything that we just talked about, like this stuff was becoming very popular in the 70s, and so people believed in Atlantis, Lemuria. They believed in crystals and Reiki and spirit animals and all that stuff, pyramid power. There was just a credulity around all of it. Like maybe it is true because religion's been lying to us for thousands of years, just like the government was lying to us about the Vietnam War, just like the civil rights movement made it clear to us that, there was all this inequity going on that was being hidden from us. People were just hungry for something different and something that was more, if we look at religion, if you read like Caliban and the Witch talking about implementation of religion and patriarchy as a way to keep producing a workforce. If you look at that, the needs of people in the 70s spiritually were different than needs of people spiritually in 30s, 40s, 50s.
Right.
So the spiritual needs of people in the 70s, as increased mechanization has changed things, the internet is coming up, the kinds of lives that we're living, having children later, being focused on self-actualization, those things aren't really fostered by traditional religion. They don't really account for that. So people needed something new to address the spiritual needs that they now had, that they weren't living lives on a farm somewhere where you work the land like your parents did. You quit school. Once you learn to read and write, you quit school, you go work on the land, you get married as soon as possible, you have as many children as possible, and then you do it all over again.
Yeah.
Now you had a population,
now.
the emergence of childhood. And I would argue that New Age spirituality is absolutely built for children. The magical thinking of it, all of it, is built to attend to the needs of emotional children that never leave adolescence. And a lot of us never do. We have the longest adolescence of like any animal ever.
Yes.
Back to Ramtha. So that's your primer. That's New Age stuff. That's Lemuria. That's Atlantis. Okay.
Okay. Now we're educated.
So we're back to Ramtha. So Ramtha appears again to Jay-Z while she's in the presence of her husband, who can't see him. Her husband is credulous through all of this. I cannot emphasize enough. He is encouraging Jay-Z. Ramtha tells her that he is from Lemuria and that he was part of a pilgrimage to Atlantis when there was a catastrophe. He was a great warrior. Then he defeated 2/3 of the world's population before he was run through with a sword and spent several years in solitude getting better, where he became an ascended master and then crossed over into becoming an interdimensional being, an entity.
Like Yoda, kind of?
Well, you know what it reminded me of?
What?
Conan the Barbarian.
Oh. I'm not familiar with it. It's just a little before my time.
So Conan the Barbarian gained significant popularity during the 30s and 40s. They were stories written by Robert E. Howard. Howard's tales of Conan were published in pulp magazines such as Weird Tales, starting in 1932. These stories introduced readers to the iconic character of Conan and his adventures in the savage and mystical world of Hyboria. Conan's popularity continued to grow in the following decades through various adaptations and different forms of media. In the 60s and 70s, the character experienced a huge resurgence in popularity due to the Conan comic books published by Marvel, featuring artwork by artists such as Barry Windsor Smith and Josh Buscema. These comics helped to solidify Conan's image in popular culture. So when I first heard this story, it just reminded me of the Conan movies. When she channels Ramtha, he uses the word, I was a barbarian. You know, I mean, it's even using the words.
Wow.
But he like basically conquers the world and then has everything he wants and then kind of becomes a philosopher king. He goes through like a period of despair and depression and then comes out the other side, now a philosopher king. In the Hour of the Dragon, Conan has already become the king of Aquilonia. However, he's overthrown and loses his throne to a group of conspirators. After being captured and imprisoned, Conan manages to escape and embarks on a quest to retrieve the heart of Ahriman, a powerful artifact that could potentially restore his kingdom. During this journey, Conan faces various trials, battles, formidable enemies, and sustains injuries. It is during a moment of physical weakness and vulnerability that Conan has a revelation about the true nature of power, responsibility, and the fate of his kingdom. This revelation leads him to take decisive action and make sacrifices in order to reclaim his throne and fulfill his destiny as a great ruler. The Hour of the Dragon is one of the longer and more complex Conan stories, showcasing Conan's determination, cunning, and his growth as a character. Is considered one of the seminal tales in the Conan canon. Say that 3 times fast. And is often regarded as one of the best Conan stories ever written. I don't know if she was a fan of the Conan books, but she did have young sons in the 70s, and it was a comic book staple. And there are a lot of parallels between Ramtha's backstory and the story of Conan the Barbarian. The 60s and 70s also just saw a major surge in the popularity of the fantasy genre. I'm bringing all of this up because it helps demystify the teachings of Ramtha and also to show that not only Jay-Z, but her audience was very primed to believe and be interested in the kind of story that Jay-Z was telling.
Yes.
Aliens, New Age philosophy, and a barbarian warrior turned philosopher king from a lost civilization were everywhere you looked. So in the context of her time, this particular backstory would have been both strange and familiar to people. So back to Ramtha. So after Ramtha appears to Jay-Z a few times, her husband, who is still credulous and supportive, takes her to, I'm going to call like a paranormal specialist lady. And for the first time, instead of simply appearing to Jay-Z, Ramtha moves through her and she channels him.